Good morning. If there's one thing Americans love, it's a good courtroom drama. Right? Just think about TV shows that you've watched over the years. Shows like Law and Order, LA Law, Perry Mason, Suits, How to Get Away with Murder, Ally McBeal, Matlock. Right? All of our TV is just filled with lawyer shows. And think about all the reality TV shows that we watch having to do with judges, right? There was People's Court with Judge Wapner. There was Judge Judy. There was America's Court with Judge Ross. There was Divorce Court. And there was Judge Joe Brown. In fact, right now on television, there's even a TV show that's hosted by Judge Jerry Springer. It's hard to believe it, but there are actually people out there who are willing to have their legal disputes decided by Jerry Springer. Now, as a lawyer, I appear in front of judges all the time, and I can tell you it is a really tough job. Just think about the qualities that a perfect judge needs to have. On the one hand, a perfect judge has to apply the law equally to everyone as it's written. When a judge refuses to apply the law equally, cases are decided based on the judge's own whims and his prejudices. We cease to be a nation of laws, and we become a nation of judicial tyrants and dictators, right? On the other hand, a perfect judge shouldn't rigidly apply the law, even when it would result in a terrible injustice, right? A judge's highest goal should be to achieve justice. That's why we call it the justice system, right? But do you see how these two ideas can sometimes be in tension with each other? What happens when applying the law as it's written would result in a terrible injustice? And what should a judge do when the prosecutors who are applying the law are even worse than the person who is being accused of breaking the law? Well, there's a passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus sits as a judge applying the Jewish law, or the Torah, the law of Moses. It is a first century courtroom drama. The biblical equivalent of Law and Order, or LA Law, or Matlock, right? Turn with me to John chapter 8 in your Bibles, and we're going to discuss this morning the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. And as you listen to this passage this morning, I want each of you in the audience to serve as judges. I want each of you to ask yourselves, is Jesus a good judge in this case? Does Jesus apply the law? Does he apply it faithfully, the way it's written? Does Jesus reach a just result? So I'm going to have you judge Jesus as judge. Now, before we read this story, I need to address an elephant in the room. You will notice that some of the Bible translations have an asterisk or a footnote next to this passage that says, this passage is not included in the earliest Greek manuscripts. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is whether this story should even be part of the Bible to begin with. What's the evidence in favor of including this story in the Bible? Let's talk some numbers. Of the Greek manuscripts for the book of John, 1,495 manuscripts include this story, and 267 do not include it. That means about 85% of the ancient manuscripts had this passage in it. We also have numerous references to this passage by the early church fathers, including some references that date back as far as the early 2nd century, so around 100 AD. Not too long after this story was written, we have church fathers already talking about it. The story is found in the Latin Vulgate, which was prepared by Jerome in the year 383, based on the Greek manuscripts that Jerome considered to be ancient at that time in 383. The story is consistent with the character of Jesus and the other teaching that we have in the gospel. And finally, this story contains historical details that we know to be factually accurate from other historical sources, including details about Jewish legal thinking in the first century. So that's the evidence in favor of including the story. What's the evidence against including the story? Well, some of the 267 Greek manuscripts that do not include the story are among the oldest manuscripts. Generally speaking, older manuscripts are considered to be more reliable than newer manuscripts. And some of the manuscripts that include this story have it placed in Luke or in a different place in John. So, what's the general consensus amongst conservative biblical scholars? The general consensus is that this story actually happened and that John wrote about it. The fact that some of the manuscripts omit this story can be explained by its hot-button subject matter. Some of the ancient scribes appear to have been reluctant to include this story in the gospel because they were concerned that it could be misconstrued as condoning adultery. One of the early church fathers, Augustine, St. Augustine, as I'm sure you've heard, explained the controversy this way. Augustine wasn't anyone for mincing words, so his quote's a little strong. He says, quote, "Certain persons of little faith, or rather, enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be given impunity in sinning, removed from their manuscripts the Lord's act of forgiveness toward the adulteress, as if he who had said, 'Sin no more,' had granted permission to sin." The bottom line is that we can read this story with confidence that it was part of the original gospel narrative. Now, before we dive into the story, let me give you some background information. This passage takes place in about mid-September of the third and final year of Jesus' ministry, roughly about 7 months before his death and resurrection. Jesus has come to the city of Jerusalem, the capital city of the ancient Jewish people, in secret to celebrate the Jewish festival of Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles, which is one of the 3 festivals in which observant Jews would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Festival of Sukkot marked the end of the harvest, and it lasted for 7 days. By this time in his ministry, Jesus is a polarizing figure. Some people are claiming he's a prophet and even the Messiah. Others are claiming he's deceiving the people. And the religious leaders in Jerusalem are up in arms about him. They are already looking for a way to kill him. And everyone is wondering whether Jesus is going to show up at the festival. Suddenly, midway through the festival, at the beginning of chapter 7, Jesus stands up and appears in the temple, and he starts teaching about scriptures. He's saying very provocative things. He's saying things like, "My teaching is not mine, but comes from him who sent me." And then he confronts the Pharisees. And this is really important to understanding this passage. He says to them, "Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keep the law." Ooh, the Pharisees are furious about that, right? They pride themselves on being the heirs to Moses. They are the most religious of all the Jews. They are punctilious about making sure that they're complying with every part of the law. So when Jesus says to them, "You're not following the law," oh, that gets them really angry. In fact, it gets them so angry that at the end of chapter 7 of the book of John, they go to the temple guards and they say, "You need to arrest Jesus because he's the one who's been breaking the Jewish law by healing people on the Sabbath." So the temple guards go to arrest Jesus. He's surrounded by all the people. He's teaching them really incredibly, and the temple guards can't bring themselves to arrest him. They say to the Pharisees, "No one has ever spoken the way that this man has." So the Pharisees' plot to arrest Jesus in the temple is foiled. So they come up with a plan to trap Jesus. A really clever plan based on their knowledge of the law. They're going to make it seem like Jesus is the one who doesn't keep the law, right? They're going to embarrass him. How dare he accuse us of not following the law? We're going to show that he doesn't follow the law. And so our story begins at John, in the book of John, chapter 8, verse 2. Now, early in the morning, Jesus came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such a person should be stoned. But what do you say?" This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. Now let's stop here for a minute and unpack the Pharisees' trap. We've got a woman caught in the very act of adultery. The law that she broke was Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. And here's what it says. "If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman." Now, the Jewish law, the law of Moses, had very strict rules governing sexual immorality. Apparently, the Canaanite people were well known throughout the ancient world for their sexual immorality, and these laws were designed to protect the Israelites from becoming corrupted by the Canaanites' permissive lifestyles. These laws against adultery were actually quite common in the ancient world. Under the Babylonian code of Hammurabi, adultery was punishable by death by drowning. And if you can believe it, there are still laws on the books today in the United States outlining adultery in 16 states. In Massachusetts, Idaho, and Georgia, adultery is considered a felony and is punishable by up to 3 years in prison. Still today in America. Now, of course, although these laws remain on the books in these 16 states, they're very unpopular. They're never enforced. And in fact, there's a serious question as to whether they'd be constitutional in light of some of the recent rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court. But what's true today about these laws remaining on the books and maybe not always being enforced was also true in ancient Israel. This law forbidding adultery, it was very unpopular amongst the ancient Jews. In fact, they viewed it as really unduly harsh. And so, over the years, the Jewish legal authorities had interpreted the law in a way that made it virtually impossible to enforce. A person caught in adultery under Jewish law could be executed by stoning only if 3 conditions were met. 1, there had to be at least 2 witnesses in the court. If there was just 1 witness, it wasn't enough, not enough. 2, all of the witnesses had to agree exactly in their testimony. If one witness's testimony was a little bit different from the other witness, not enough, couldn't proceed. And this third requirement is really, really important for understanding this passage. The person caught in it was being charged with adultery under the Jewish law had to be caught in the actual act of adultery. If you can believe it, it would not have been enough under Jewish law to catch a man and woman together in the same bed. That's not enough for this to exact punishment under this law. At least 2 witnesses who agreed exactly on their testimony had to catch the man and the woman actually engaged in the act of sex itself. That was what was required under Jewish law to enact this punishment. Now, as you can imagine, given the type of evidence that's required here, this law was rarely enforced at the time of Jesus. Adultery usually takes place in private, so you almost never have 2 witnesses to the actual act of adultery. Yet, the Pharisees had managed to find a clear violation of the law. They tell Jesus that they caught the woman, quote, in the very act, unquote, of adultery. And it's clear the Pharisees are aware of the legal requirements under Jewish law because they emphasize that they've satisfied those legal requirements in verse 4. They say to Jesus, quote, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act itself." Now, apart from this law being unpopular and requiring very stringent proof, there's another very practical reason why this law was never enforced during Jesus' time. In the first century, there was no nation of Israel. Israel was part of the Roman Empire, and it was subject to Roman law. And while the Roman authorities gave the local Jewish authorities some power to prosecute minor offenses, capital offenses, right, offenses that required death, could only be punished by the Romans. Now, before 17 BC, if a Roman man caught his wife in the act of adultery, he was free to kill both his wife and the man who he caught with her. But in 17 BC, about 50 years before this passage takes place, Augustus Caesar passed a series of laws called the Julian Moral Code. And under the Julian Moral Code, adultery remained illegal, but it was no longer punishable by death. Under Roman law, at the time of Jesus, a woman convicted of adultery would lose half her dowry, she would lose a third of her property, and she could potentially be banished from the community. Now, there was one exception. The husband of a woman who committed adultery retained the power to kill a man who committed adultery with his wife if the man committing adultery was from the lower classes. This is like the gardener or the pool boy exception. But he could not kill his own wife. In the Roman Empire, if a husband killed his wife for adultery, he would be prosecuted for murder. Right? So now do you see the trap that the Pharisees have laid? They were putting Jesus in a no-win situation. If he refused to execute the woman caught in adultery, he would be violating Jewish law and condoning sexual immorality. And that would hurt his standing as a rabbinic leader and a prophet, right? But if Jesus ordered the woman caught in adultery to be executed, he would be violating Roman law, and he could be executed by the Romans for murder. No matter how Jesus decides this case, he's going to get himself in trouble with somebody. Right? He's either going to get himself in trouble with the Jews for not applying Jewish law, or he's going to get himself in trouble with the Romans for violating Roman law. Now that we understand the trap that the Pharisees have laid for Jesus, let's take a minute to step back and consider what's really going on here. Do you remember that law in Deuteronomy chapter 22? It says, "If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die. Both the man that lay with the woman and the woman." Where's the man? Right? The Pharisees were supposed to punish both the man and the woman, but they only brought the woman to Jesus. We know that the Pharisees caught both the man and the woman, right? Because they said they caught them in the act itself, right? So they had to have caught the man and the woman together. Why did the Pharisees let the man go and only bring the woman to Jesus? It seems pretty clear what's going on here. The Pharisees have entrapped this woman. The man was working with the Pharisees. The man seduced the woman. The man arranged for Pharisees, he arranged for her to come to a place where he knew the Pharisees would be watching so that they could catch her in the actual act. To put it simply, the Pharisees set this woman up, right? They're going to use her to take down a political rival. That's why the Pharisees didn't bring the man before Jesus, and that's how the Pharisees were able to produce multiple witnesses to an incredibly private, an intimate act. The Pharisees are in cahoots with the man, right? They deliberately set out to entrap this woman. This is a case where the accusers, or the prosecutors, are worse than the person being accused. These Pharisees are willing to publicly humiliate this woman and cause her death just to disgrace a political rival. How is Jesus going to decide this case? He's got a woman who's clearly guilty of adultery. She broke the law. But he's also got prosecutors who are abusing the law for political gain. How is Jesus going to faithfully apply the law and reach a just result? Let's go back to the story at verse 6. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear them. That's interesting. Jesus responds to the Pharisees' question by writing on the ground with his finger. This is one of the great mysteries of the Bible. John tells us that Jesus was writing on the ground, but he doesn't tell us what Jesus was writing. So, of course, over the centuries, biblical scholars have speculated about what Jesus might have been writing on the ground. Some scholars think Jesus was just doodling in the dirt, right? They think he may have been intentionally ignoring the Pharisees because he knew what they were doing and he didn't like it one bit. He knew they were being very, very bad people here. Or Jesus could have been delaying his response for dramatic effect. Imagine how the crowd would have responded to that delay. What is Jesus going to say? Right? What's going to happen here? Now, the medieval church has a tradition that Jesus wrote the words terra, terram, accusat, which means earth accuses earth in Latin. And it refers to Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, which states, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." In fact, if you look at medieval paintings that are about this story, they will sometimes have the words terra, terram, accusat written by Jesus on the ground because it was such a commonly understood tradition. I hate to break it to the medieval Christians, but I sincerely doubt that Jesus was writing in Latin, since it's highly unlikely he would be speaking Latin to other Jews in the temple. So let's explore some other possibilities. Other scholars think that Jesus wrote about the Pharisees who were accusing the woman of adultery. They think he may have written out the names of the accusers and their own sins. Think about how embarrassing that would have been for the Pharisees. Here they are attempting to publicly humiliate this woman for adultery, and all of a sudden Jesus starts writing all about their own deepest, darkest secrets on the ground in front of everybody. Right? Other scholars think maybe Jesus wrote out a warning to their accusers from the law. A passage like Exodus chapter 23, verse 1, which says, "Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness." Finally, some people think that Jesus followed the Roman judicial practice of writing out the charges against the woman and providing a written ruling of his decision. So what did Jesus write? We don't know. But I personally think it's one of the last two explanations. And here's why. The regular Greek word for writing is graphein. But the word used here is unusual. It's katagraphein, which means to write down a record against someone. So who could Jesus be writing a record against? There's two possibilities, right? He could have been writing a record against the accusers, the Pharisees. He could have been accusing the accusers and pointing out all of their misdeeds, right? That would add a real sense of irony to this passage. And it would certainly help explain why the accusers reacted the way that they do, which we'll get to in a minute. Or Jesus could have been writing out the charges against the accused woman. This would emphasize how seriously Jesus took his role as judge, making sure that he was complying with a judge's procedural requirements under the law, right? He's taking his responsibility very seriously. So I think it's one of those two. No one really knows. You can fill in which one you like the best here. All right, let's return to the story at verse 7. Jesus, the judge, makes his first ruling from the bench. So when they continued asking him, Jesus raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. This is one of the most famous lines in the entire Bible. Even people who aren't Christians have heard this statement. And it's famous for good reason. Jesus is saying we should be careful about judging the moral failings of other people because each of us has our own moral failings. And this point has special significance here in the story. The accusers were engaging in conduct that was even worse than the woman that they were accusing. Jesus makes a similar point in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." It is very easy, it's too easy, for us to judge others while remaining blind to our own sins. But is this all that Jesus is saying here? After all, Jesus was perfect and sinless. Jesus didn't have any moral failings. There was nothing stopping Jesus, the judge, in this case, from pronouncing a sentence against this woman, right? In fact, if there was anyone who was without sin, it was Jesus. So there's a little more going on here than meets the eye. And the secret to unpacking exactly what Jesus is doing here is to look at his reference to throwing the first stone. You see, Jesus knows the Jewish law better than the Pharisees. And he's engaging in a bit of judicial jujitsu. He is turning the tables on the Pharisees, and he's putting them in the hot seat. He's taking the trap that they set for him, and he's turning around and he's catching them in that trap. And I want you to understand this morning how he's doing that. When Jesus talks about throwing the first stone, he's referring to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7, a specific passage in the Jewish law that governs capital crimes. Deuteronomy 17:7 says, quote, "The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death." Under Jewish law, the witnesses who testified against the accused in a capital case were required to throw the first stone. Jesus is saying to the Pharisees here, hey, if you want to follow the Jewish law, you have to follow the entire law. You're the ones who are accusing this woman of adultery, so under the law, your witnesses have to throw the first stone. Now, of course, the Pharisees were never going to throw the first stone. If they threw the first stone, they would be the ones who were enforcing this unpopular law, right? They would be the ones who would be facing murder charges from the Romans. The Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus, but Jesus has trapped the Pharisees instead. He's called their bluff. He has reminded them of their own responsibilities under the law, and the Pharisees are now forced into a dilemma. Either they can execute this woman and face the consequences of it, right? A prosecution potentially from the Romans for murder, or they have to admit that they were never really serious about prosecuting this woman in the first place. Let's continue with verse 9 and see what happens. Then those Pharisees who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So Jesus announces his verdict. The woman will not be put to death. Why? The Pharisees have not met their burden under the law of presenting two witnesses. When Jesus pointed out that the Pharisees' witnesses had to throw the first stone, the Pharisees' witnesses suddenly got cold feet. They refused to testify. As a result, there was no evidence presented against the woman at her trial. The case against her had to be dismissed. Right? That's exactly what would happen in an American courtroom today. Imagine if someone was put on trial, but none of the witnesses showed up. What would the judge do? He would dismiss the case for lack of evidence. But this story doesn't end like the typical American courtroom drama. Right? On TV, when the jury announces a verdict of not guilty, the defendant's attorneys and the family and the friends, they all gather around her and they celebrate the acquittal. Right? You've been vindicated. Here, the woman's friends and family don't gather around her to celebrate. Thanks to Jesus, the woman may have avoided the death penalty, but there are still real-life consequences to her actions. John makes the point that the woman is left alone at the end of the story. She's been abandoned by her family and her friends. Her unfaithfulness to her husband has been publicly revealed. Her lover is nowhere to be found. And she's almost certainly facing a nasty divorce, financial insecurity, and social censure. Notice that Jesus doesn't excuse what she did or tell her that everything is going to be okay. She's made her bed, and now she's got to lie in it. At the same time, however, Jesus treats the woman with love and compassion. Jesus doesn't condemn her, he forgives her, and most importantly, he sees her as someone who is capable of redemption. And he gives her excellent advice, advice that we should all follow today. Go and sin no more. Now that we're at the end of this story, let's assess Jesus' performance as a judge. Did Jesus correctly apply the Jewish law? Yes. The Pharisees failed to meet their burden under the Jewish law of presenting two witnesses to the crime. Because the Pharisees did not present any evidence, the legal evidence required to support her conviction, Jesus ruled correctly in refusing to find the woman guilty of adultery. Did Jesus reach a just result? I think so. The woman was just a pawn in a political dispute. The Pharisees entrapped her, and they were seeking to apply an anachronistic law against her unequally and unfairly. Where was the man? I can't think of a more unfair application of the law, to take one of the people but not the other. At the same time, Jesus treats this woman with love and encourages her to pursue a path of redemption by sinning no more. He also foils the Pharisees' plot. He forces them to recognize that what they were doing is wrong. I suspect it will be a very long time before these Pharisees are casting any stones. Now it's time for your verdict. What do you think? Is Jesus a perfect judge?
Yes. Yes.
Bow your heads with me for a moment as we close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are both a just and forgiving God. It is so easy for us to accuse others and so hard for us to recognize our own failings. Please help us to treat others with the same love and respect as Jesus treated the woman in this story. And please forgive us when we fall short like the woman in this story. We rejoice in the fact that this world, with all of its disputes and all of its moral failings, rests in the hands of such a capable judge.